The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everybody. We're really excited that you could join our webinar today. I am Marty Pickett, Managing Director and General Counsel at RMI, and I have Amory Lovins, our Chief Scientist and Founder, and Jules Kortenhorst, our CEO. We are coming to you live from the Innovation Center in Basalt, Colorado, and it's snowing outside. And we have Sir Richard Branson with us from a very different climate. Richard is a wonderful supporter, founded Carbon War Room that merged with us in almost 2 years ago, and is an interesting guy with interest in land, sea, air, and space. Sir Richard, please kick us off.
Well, look, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. And as always, thanks to the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Carbon War Room. And thank you to Amory, to Jules, to all the staff, to all the supporters for the incredible work you do. And I'm afraid we need that more than ever today. Well, I'm delighted that the Carbon War Room, which we founded nearly 7 years ago, merged with the Rocky Mountain Institute a couple of years ago this month. The organisation has grown significantly. Now it has offices in Basalt, in Boulder, in New York City, in DC, and Beijing. And it's absolutely amazing. And I'm excited to announce that today that an anonymous donor has offered to match all gifts received within the next 48 hours of this call up to $50,000. So if anyone's listening out there, that would be very welcome. There hasn't been a better time to support this work, and your work is more crucial, I suspect, than ever. The Paris Climate Summit was a pinnacle of success, and countries set out the most ambitious targets to date to mitigate runaway climate change. But their commitments are currently not enough to limit temperature change to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And political winds can shift, as obviously is evidenced by the recent US election. But the power of economics is nonpartisan, thank God, and universal, as the Rocky Mountain Institute has always known. The global carbon budget makes it clear that our energy system, it needs to be decarbonised by the middle of the century. And there is still too much reliance on oil, gas, and, of course, coal, the worst of all, across industry. But what excites me about RMI and CWR is how they continuously show how shifting to energy efficiency and to renewables is smart, it's profitable, and it can be accelerated because of their market-driven, business-led approach. It's amazing how much of your work is now international. I think nearly 50%, if I'm right, in China, where you've made a massive difference, in Africa, in small island nations, which we've been one of the beneficiaries of. So RMI CWR is well poised to meet the climate challenge. The world is also a better place than ever to tackle climate change and to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy. From my business perspective, I see that the cost of renewables are declining rapidly, and renewables are increasingly the most competitive form of power generation. New and disruptive business and financing models are emerging, and I'm delighted to sound part of some of those, and maturing for energy efficiency, clean energy, and mobility. Capital is shifting from fossil fuel-based energy to low-carbon energy investment, and solving the challenges of providing clean, renewable energy solves major problems we are facing with air pollution, health, and education in many developing economies. I firmly believe that by supporting RMI's efforts with business, government, and civil society, we can meet the challenges of climate change. But we can't let time run out. And as you learn more today about RMI CWR's work, I hope you'll join me and Virgin Unite in supporting their work. Have a wonderful discussion. Have a great holiday after the discussion. And over to you, Amory, over to you, Jules, and over to you, Marty. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, Sir Richard. We so appreciate you joining. And just a few logistics for everyone who's joined. I want you to know that we had to actually expand onto Facebook because we way went over the number of people that we could have on the webinar, over 1,000 people. We have almost 20% of you are from countries outside of the United States, so Thank you for joining us in very odd time zones right now. We had countries, Jules and I were just looking, we had Denmark, the UK, Australia,
South Africa,
your home country.
the Netherlands, of course, yes.
So, and I also saw lots of people from very large businesses, from small startups, from universities, from government, other NGOs. So we have a real diverse audience and group to have a conversation with today. Some of you have already sent in questions that we have compiled. We will try to get to them, answer them. Please chat your questions during this next hour. There may be an opportunity for our host to ask you to raise your hand and come on and ask us live your question. So stay tuned for that. We also hope to have at least one, maybe two, polls of the audience throughout the hour so that we can get your feedback on some things. So look for those. And then I'll announce those answers. So let's get started. We have a lot to cover. Jules and Amory and I had dinner around this table last night, and it was a wonderful 3+ hour conversation, so we'll try not to do that today. But we're really excited to share with you a lot of what the organization is thinking now, short term, and in the long term. A lot has happened over the past few years since Jules arrived 3.5 years ago. We've grown a lot, we're flourishing a lot under Jules' leadership. And Amory founded RMI 35 years ago next April, but 40 years ago wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that has been the most reprinted article ever in Foreign Affairs. And I know that you were just at the Council on Foreign Affairs talking about that. So let's start out. I'd love to ask you, Jules, what are you most proud of at RMI right now? This is my question, not the audience question.
Well, it is indeed very exciting to see how we have grown internationally. And we started off with a lot of our work here in the United States, and Amory traveling around the world and telling the story of our insights, but most of the work here in the United States. Now, as Sir Richard was already saying, over half of our work is outside the United States. And maybe the most exciting part from an impact perspective, the work that we do in China, where we have a team of 12 people, soon grown to 15, and where we are helping both the central government and cities to really put implementation plans in place behind the Reinventing Fire China vision and the commitment that China made in Paris. What is also exciting is as we grow, we bring on board so many new colleagues, often young colleagues. And that, to me, goes to my personal motivation for this. I believe that this is the most important challenge that we face as humanity. And I feel that it is my responsibility to dedicate myself to this for my 4 children, who are a huge inspiration for me, but also for all the other young people around the world.
Absolutely.
Well, so far we've reframed the energy problem, catalyzed the transformation of the mobility, buildings, and electricity sectors and a number of parts of industry, and figured out for the U.S. and China, and earlier for Germany, how to do an efficiency and renewables-based future that makes sense, makes money, cheaper than what we're doing now, and would greatly improve jobs, security, environment, and development. That's a pretty good start, and there's a lot more coming out of that. Decades of intellectual capital to keep developing and exploiting, and I think we can barely imagine what progress we're going to make in the coming years.
So we want to get to short-term and long-term. So let's go to short-term. What do you think are the priorities over this next year or two? Amory, let me start with you, because I want to turn to you, Jules, to ask about what are you thinking about scaling mechanisms, because we are, although we've grown a lot, we're still a small group, so how can we really make the change that we have to make all over the country and world?
Well, we have a lot going on, some geographically based, like the China work and Africa and islands, some sectorally based, and Jules will say more about those. I want to give a little bigger picture. There was just a piece by two of my colleagues on our website and on GreenBiz about how to apply the very rapid deployment that has occurred along S-curves with a number of technologies, and the mechanisms are pretty well understood. The pace of change can be much faster than normal predictions based on incremental capital replacement. And a simple example is if you, Tony Seba has illustrated this with National Archives photos. If you look down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in 1900, you have to look hard to find the first car in the Easter Parade. 13 years later, you have to look even harder to find what might be the last horse, and I don't think there is a horse in that picture. The fraction of U.S. households owning a car went from 8 to 80% in 10 years. 3/4 of them thanks to a financial innovation from GM and DuPont called car loans. Well, the basic reason all this happened is that Henry Ford cut the cost of a Model T 62% in 13 years. But in our time, photovoltaic modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. 3/4 of the rooftop solar in places like California is innovatively financed. We're seeing the same story all over again. The difference now is that this very rapid change can be driven by linkages that we are trying hard to understand, to see which we can accelerate, which we can fill in where they're not there, between sectors that might be adjacent and tangent and might be quite remote. A small example is that the battery technology in these devices, trying to cram more energy in less space, is driven by the need to make your devices run longer, but that technology is what makes batteries effective for electric cars, leading to companies like Tesla, Chevrolet, many others, producing enormous numbers of those batteries. Then they get cheap. Then we start having distributed solar all over the place. That then affects fuel prices. And when you look at these spreading waves of innovation, spreading from sector to sector in quite unexpected ways, that's where this very rapid kind of growth can come from. And we are about to publish 5 scenarios for how to achieve a 1.5 Celsius degree climate scenario. It is not easy, but it is feasible, which many analysts using conventional tools don't see because they're not looking hard enough at the rapid scaling that is now possible.
And it is exactly that nonlinear scaling that we're also looking for in our programs. So what you're referring to is the change that we are seeing in the energy marketplace, which is no longer on the traditional straight line path, but increasingly on S-curves that are mutually reinforcing. And then for us the question is, where can we best intervene, where can we do our work to help accelerate those trends? So let me give you a couple of very specific examples. We have always believed at Rocky Mountain Institute and at the Carbon War Room that the key lever for change is business and marketplaces. And so over the course of the last 2 years, we've brought together a group of over 160 companies that are now together the largest buyers of renewable electricity in the United States. This Business Renewable Center has been a huge success here in the US, and the companies involved are now looking, hey, can we not do the same work in China, where obviously we already have a presence and are happy to move next.
Got our first member there yesterday.
We just got our first member, exactly. Similarly, we are looking at the learnings that we take from helping islands in the Caribbean make a transition to a low-carbon electricity system, and comparing that to the work that we're doing in Africa, and stimulating sort of cross-learning between two continents. And then in Africa, you might not think about it, but what we're doing there is remote solar in villages, microgrids, is in fact also applicable to our thinking for community solar here in the United States, which is a sector that is scaling, and where we see with both better engineering and better procurement and supply chain solutions and better permitting and regulatory frameworks, an ability to drop prices again by 30-40% over the next couple of years. So lots of opportunity. That does beg the interesting question, what do we work on? And next week we're spending about 2.5 days with many members of our team sitting together to say, okay, are we doing the best job in allocating our philanthropy money, the money of our supporters, to put it right there where we can have the biggest impact? That's always a challenge, but I think we have a good mechanism now in place by reviewing our programs on a very regular basis and saying, where should we allocate our scarce resources?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of donors, we have some questions coming in, but I also want to just give a shout out. We mentioned the countries, but in this country, in the United States, where we do still the majority of our work, we have folks from both coasts. We have Peter, our trustee, in San Francisco. We have our major supporter, Fred, in North Carolina. Thank you, Fred, as always. And Professor Babs joined us this morning. We have a question actually from a couple of people about the Paris Accord. Will it move forward if the U.S. drops out? We're getting a lot of questions around the recent U.S. elections. So I think we should tackle that briefly. Amory, last night you made a really interesting comment.
Yeah, it's from Cutler Cleveland, who writes the standard textbook on environmental science. He points out that the president is not the federal government is not all government, and government is not the only, or I would say even the most important actor in driving energy and climate transformation. And then if you dissect each of those and look at the forces at work, you discover that what matters the most by far is the alignment of business on keep calm and carry on and make money. In our Business Renewables Council a month ago, 170 companies of nearly all that were there responded to the question, how will you change your U.S. renewable investment strategy in light of the election? These are companies that last year were responsible for 90% or so of the 3.5 billion watts of renewable contracts that corporations bought directly, not through utilities. Like that was over half the wind power market. So 3% of the companies said they'll back off. 5% said they'll invest more overseas. 25% said they'll invest more in the U.S., and the rest said steady on course. This is exactly what a sensible company will do. They will either stay on course or double down because the economics continue to drive the opportunity ever faster, and there's really not much that even a strongly opposed federal executive can do about that, because after all, most U.S. energy policy is not even federal. It's made at a state and local level. That's where we regulate utilities, that's where we do building codes and so on. The federal policy is pretty firmly entrenched and very hard to change in any way that would materially affect the markets.
Yeah, let me build on that. I think that we are in such a different situation now than we were, say, 5-6 years ago. The technologies that are driving the energy transition are largely profitable. Not everywhere, not every technology, but things are happening so fast and the commercial and technological developments are so rapid that we have the wind in our sails. And then secondly, as you said, that doesn't mean that policy is not important, that doesn't mean that regulation is not important, but that policy and regulation happens at so many different levels. So even if there is a shift in federal policy and regulation, it doesn't necessarily impact the local electricity market in New York or in California. In fact, in New York, we were very much part of New York REV, the revision of the regulatory framework of the electricity system in that state, and that work will carry on independent of what happens in Washington. And then you can ask, okay, but what are the implications internationally? Will the Paris Accord move forward if the US drops out? I'm not convinced the US will drop out. I think that President-elect Trump is still trying to make up his mind. He, of course, has brought some people on his team who are a little bit doubtful about the international agreement, but the nominated Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has in fact, 2 days after Trump's election, endorsed the Paris Accord and said that it was important for the US to stay involved. But I'm just back from China, and I tell you, it almost does not matter what the United States decides. China is so deeply committed to this energy transition, of course because of the air pollution, and of course because they believe in climate change, but fundamentally also because they see the tremendous commercial opportunity. I had the opportunity to dine and lunch with a number of CEOs and founders of great clean tech companies in China, and they are excited about the business opportunities. They are excited about the international growth, and the dynamic that is happening there is not going to go away if the engagement of the United States in the Paris Agreement is less there.
Yeah, to pick a simple example, we have people right now in Delhi arranging for a seminar that the Prime Minister's office has caused to be set up in the National Planning Agency, Niti Aayog, to figure out how to transform personal and public mobility in India, so all 2-, 3-, and 4-wheelers, in the ambition of the very impressive energy minister, become electrified by 2030. This is strongly supported by the companies that own most of the car market in India and by companies in, say, the taxi business. It's a very exciting convergence of government and business interests. And I think it's clear that in India, as in China, to the extent the U.S. retreated from its obligations or from its commercial pursuit of clean energy, these other countries, as in Europe, would simply see it as an opportunity to move into the space we had vacated. That doesn't mean it will happen slower. It may happen even more ambitiously. And in a way, the anti-climate protection rhetoric that was going around after the election reinforced the resolve of the 196 other countries at Marrakesh.
Absolutely. And one of our National Solutions Council members asked a question about how is the interplay between competitiveness and policy or regulation. And I think that points to a very important insight, Amory. If India decides that indeed they only want to have electric vehicles on the road by 2030, then that positions the automotive industry in India extremely well for playing a large role in the electric vehicle market as it emerges. In exactly the same way as Denmark was for the longest time alone in regulating and demanding wind power, but as a result, it is now one of the leading technology providers worldwide in wind energy, and Vestas is in fact one of the top 3 worldwide wind turbine companies. So by putting a challenging regulation in place, yes, in the short run, you might face some challenges, but in the longer run, you are building a competitive industry in that segment. And it does beg the question what the incoming administration will therefore judge. Will they bet on protecting the energy sources of the past? Will they focus on trying to reinvigorate the coal sector? Or will they bet that in the end the energy transition is happening and the United States has a unique position in it and they want to continue to lead in that sector, and therefore we're going to double down on it?
There have been comments from even some leaders in the coal utility industry in this country that you can't revive the coal industry. I would put it more bluntly and say you can defibrillate a corpse, but it will not arise and walk. I mean, it's because of economics, much more than policy. And I think the point Jules is making is terribly important. These are competitive global markets. China is now the world leader in 7 kinds of renewables, would like to be in all. In 2013 alone, China added more solar power capacity than the U.S. had added in the previous 59 years put together. We have some catching up to do. We have many strengths in the dynamism of our innovation, our market mechanisms. They have other kinds of strengths in planned activities as well as an emerging, very dynamic private sector. And we're all going to get to slug it out in the global marketplace. This is the time to reinforce those commitments to competitiveness, and I think some of the people who understand this are actually going into the cabinet. Rick Perry comes to mind, the nominee for Secretary of Energy. He presided over much of the growth under the free market policies introduced by Governor George W. Bush that made Texas by far the national leader in wind power. So he knows that that works, and it can beat gas. That's okay. If you want cheaper electricity, that's what you do.
Yeah. So you mentioned the National Solutions Council folks. Thank you for giving a shout out. We're really excited to have a large number, hundreds of National Solutions Council members who we hope to give more opportunities like this to join. So thank you for your questions. We have some of yours from already and then more coming in today. One I see that is a recurring question is about the reform of the utility regulation and financial incentives. Another one, Amory, I want you to keep in mind because you're just, I know, biting at the bit to answer this, and this is there anything beyond new technological advances that we should or could be doing? Is that the most important thing? But do you want to talk about the utility regulation a little bit to answer?
Yeah, the utility regulation is incredibly important, and we have probably about 15, 20 of our colleagues who focus their efforts in that arena. Very crucially, the market for electricity in the future is no longer going to be a top-down market where power producers send electrons down the system to consumers across the country. It is a much more transactive market. It looks much more like the internet, where companies and consumers collaborate to use and to supply the energy that we all need. And you can sort of envision that place already. Think of the house that Elon Musk has been painting, the picture that he has been painting of a house with solar panels on the roof and a battery in the garage and a Tesla that provides an opportunity to feed electricity back in the grid when that is needed, but that can also live on its own solar on a sunny afternoon. And it is this interplay of different actors, suppliers and consumers. Prosumers is the term that is often used, of different actors in the electricity market that we have to regulate. And we have to regulate it in such a way that we understand exactly when do we have too many electrons, when have we maybe a bit short electrons, and how do we balance that market. Often there is the misunderstanding that that cannot yet be done with the intermittent renewables, but we've shown in our research and in work that others have done, seen the same over and over again, that if you combine supply and demand in the right way and you make these variable renewables dance together, you can in fact create a very productive, very efficient market that supplies all the energy needs that are needed at all points of the day.
The way our colleague Clay Stranger nicely puts it is that running a modern grid with a mixture of resources at different times is like the conductor leading the symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously creates beautiful music, and that's exactly what's going on in the poor European countries that are about half renewably powered, even though they have little or no hydropower. So just figured out how to make all the supply and demand side resources work right. And perhaps the most reliable utility in the world, the former East German one, actually got 49% of all its electricity last year from solar and wind, the two variable resources. Their last big power failure was 35 years ago. And generally, as you put in more renewables, these countries' supply gets more reliable.
So let me go back to the other question, Amory, that someone sent in saying is, and this was specifically for you, do you believe that technology development is the only solution?
Well, we integrate at RMI 4 kinds of innovation, not just technology, but also design, the way you choose and combine technologies, and not only policy, but also business strategy, new financing methods, and so on. And those 4 together are immensely more powerful than any on their own. So as a lifelong technologist, I think technology will continue to advance. That's extremely important. We need to keep pushing it. We have enough technology to do the job now, but we can make it a lot better and cheaper. However, I think equally important and often neglected is the role of design, of which my house is an example, having no heating system and paying for the efficiency that did that by the capital saved by not needing the heating system. You can do the same trick in buildings, in cars, in industrial processes. And to give an example of why this matters, if you were to make the world's pipes and ducts lower friction by making them fat, short, and straight instead of skinny, long, and crooked, you could save 80 or 90% of the friction, thereby save about half the world's coal-fired electricity, paying back in less than a year typically on retrofit, less than zero in new build. And yet this is not in any official study, industry forecast, or textbook, because it's not a technology, which is what we focus on so much. It's a design method. It's actually a Victorian design method. I just used this method to save 97% of the friction in some piping added to my own house. So that's the kind of thing we want to spread around and turn it from rare to commonplace practice. I'm actually writing a really fun dialogue now between 2 fictitious Chinese factory engineers figuring out together how to untangle their pipe noodles.
Okay, as we talked about more short term, I want to move a little bit more long term, because one of the things I think that RMI, one of its signature capabilities is long-term vision and really moving big, complex systems. So we've had some questions about what's the next country for reinventing fire, how are the best ways to think about what developing countries' role might be. So let's get into that a little bit. What are your initial thoughts, Jules?
Well, we dream of a world about 10, 15, 20 years out where electrons are abundant, ubiquitous, and cheap, where mobility has been transformed to a service-based concept rather than a car-based concept, and where that service is available on demand, very smart, and obviously electrified. And finally, where demand for electricity, where electricity load is not only very efficient, but also very intelligent, it's smart. And if you bring all of those things together, you can envision a completely different energy world that is largely decarbonized. But if you then look at the current infrastructure, then you see you have to make a huge jump to get there. This is not an easy transition. And that begs this interesting question: where are the biggest opportunities? Are they in the developed world, where we already have so much of our infrastructure and so much of our asset base? Or are they in emerging economies and even in developing countries where so much of the infrastructure still has to be created? We have spent time over the last 9 months in Rwanda, and our team there has developed a strategy for the Rwanda government to bring electricity to the 78% of the country that doesn't have it yet. And the impact on their development, on their economy, on their health, on their safety is enormous. But what it also does is it creates the opportunity to build the infrastructure of the future, not the infrastructure of the past. If you compare that to the other extreme, the United States, we have a huge infrastructure that needs to be transitioned. That is a bigger challenge. Working on both sides of that equation makes us better advisors, enables us to work with businesses and governments on both sides. And the work that we do in Africa, we only recently started it when Virgin Unite and Sir Richard, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation, decided to give us some significant money to get to work there. That work is now scaling to other countries. And the really interesting challenge is there are more than 140 developing countries that need to make their plans for a low carbon energy future very tangible under the Paris Agreement. They've committed to a reduction in emissions or a steadying of emissions, and now they have to make a detailed plan how to make that happen. And they're knocking on our door, and we're wondering how can we scale this most effectively in a non-linear way. So one of the things that for me is in the future of Rocky Mountain Institute and the Carbon War Room is to look for non-linear ways of scaling our impact, so that it's not down to every project one at a time, but to mechanisms that become self-scaling.
And the main constraint is not, we think, in how fast can you scale up efficiency and renewables, as in how fast can you relocate trapped equity and get the incumbents out of the way or get them into the new businesses. So we're actually working with them too. It's very interesting how they're starting to realize that they're being decapitalized, because of course the capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And if they think you're in or headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done. They pull their money out and put it into the next thing. This is now happening to the electricity and oil industries, and they're actually starting to realize how quickly things are changing. Shell recently said through its CFO that they think peak oil demand in the world could happen as early as the next 5 years. We agree. In fact, we think it might even be a little faster than that. So I've been doing some interesting numbers around our reinventing firework, where we showed for the U.S. how to triple efficiency, quintuple renewables, and save $5 trillion, cut carbon about 84% with no new inventions and no act of Congress, led by business for profit. Then we helped the Chinese government figure out the same thing for China: 7-fold greater energy productivity, 12-fold greater carbon productivity, $3.5 trillion cheaper. That was just released at the G20 on September 5th. Now, if you put those two together, the U.S. one already being implemented on the market and on track so far, and the Chinese one that has strongly influenced the 13th five-year plan and is kind of the roadmap for the revolution they've called for from the top in production and consumption of energy, and then you extrapolate those to the rest of the world, you get to about a 2 Celsius degree climate trajectory, and it's about $18 trillion cheaper than business as usual. So I've been wondering, so what happens if you reinvest some of that in natural systems carbon removal, that is more biologically informed ways to do farming, forestry, grazing, and so on, and a lot of ecological restoration like rainforest. And it looks like that could get you to about a 1.5 degree scenario, still trillions of dollars cheaper than business as usual. We're trying to figure out how many $1 trillion, but the basic point is, yes, indeed, climate protection can be not costly but profitable. We're working up a paper on this, and we hope that will help change the politics of climate.
And when you say this way, Amory, it sounds so easy, right? If we add it all up, it works. The model is patient, the Excel spreadsheet shows it can be done.
That doesn't mean it's easy.
But we do recognize that it's not easy. Exactly. We have this debate all the time here internally, that the technical possibility does not mean that it is actually going to happen. We need all the levers to make this transition, which gets us back to the role of policy and regulation that is equally important. But the understanding that this transition can be done, commercially viably can be done, and that financial investors are now seeing that happening and are sort of counting their returns and looking at their opportunities, that does mean that at some point we'll get the wind in our sails. Just yesterday, Mayor Bloomberg and Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, published advice for companies to disclose their carbon risk, to be candid to the financial markets about what are the challenges that may come from climate change, what are the extreme weather events that we might be exposed to, what are the shifts in agricultural fertility that we might be exposed to, and at the same time, what are the business risks that we face? Is indeed peak oil, not in the sense of supply, but in the sense of demand, potentially a threat to our P&L? And by making financial investors aware of this transition, we will see the money shifting from the businesses of the past to the businesses of the future.
We've already seen trillions of dollars of shift, and I think it's accelerating.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody on the internet is asking us a question about the impacts on low-income households and what does this mean for social justice and local economic development. And that is a very good question. Because let's be honest, I can't afford a Tesla, and I think many low-income households would struggle with that as well. But yet there are some really important opportunities. Let me point out at least 3 of them. The first one is we always hammer that energy efficiency has to be first. And what energy efficiency over the long run does, it reduces energy bills. So if we are effective in changing our built environment to lower cost and cheaper energy bills, then that helps low incomes. A second area of real opportunity is to enable communities, low-income communities, to get involved in community solar. That is a new area that we see scaling up incredibly rapidly. We have a team of 4 or 5 people working on this now. We're seeing new financing mechanisms. We're seeing communities being savvier at how they deploy community solar, and we see simpler, more straightforward, standardized technological solutions, and all of that will drive the cost of solar down and will allow individuals from low-income households to participate in that. We've created a savvy financing structure together with the Green Bank of New York to enable exactly those sort of transactions. So that is the second important part. And then the third important part, and maybe the one that this incoming administration should really take to heart, the third most important part that comes with the transition to a renewable and efficient energy future is the enormous job creation that goes with it. We've seen the heavy capital-intensive fossil fuel-based energy system of the past increasingly reducing jobs. But energy efficiency and solar energy and wind is a very labor-intensive business. Installing solar panels, retrofitting houses, putting wind turbines up and maintaining them. The job creation in these industries of the future is dramatically higher than the jobs at risk in the mining sector, also here in the United States.
We have a lot more jobs already of Americans making and installing solar wind equipment than we do for all of the oil, gas, and coal workers. And those renewable jobs are much better distributed by location and by occupation. There are also technical innovations that can specifically address the needs of low-income households. For example, in the Netherlands and now spreading to other European countries, the Energie-Sprong initiative has shown how to retrofit public housing to be net zero. It will produce on its roof as much solar energy as the house uses over the year. And to do this in a way that within about another year is likely to be able to pay for itself entirely from the saved energy. So you could finance it long-term without subsidy as a public-private partnership. There's a lot of this already going on, and they've already demonstrated that by completely industrializing the retrofit process to give you a much better house with no energy bills, they can do the entire thing in one day. You go off to work in the morning, you come back, and it's done.
And our Residential Energy Plus group is doing something similar to Energie-Sprong in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of San Francisco, we have a question coming in from Peter Boyer.
Hear me?
Yes. Hi, Peter.
Great. Hi. Oh, what a wonderful call. Thank you so much, Marty, Amory, and Jules, for all you've said. Just before I make my question, I just wanted to say that this seems like a good time to point out that RMI's long-standing, strictly nonpartisan position is now really showing itself because they're able to talk to anybody in a highly charged political climate, and it makes me further proud to be part of RMI, and thank you for hanging on to that independence. It's paying off now. My question, Amory, you mentioned subsidies. So my question was basically, are government subsidies for renewables important any longer? And what if you could wave a magic wand, you and Jules, and make any recommendation and have it followed by governments regarding subsidies, what would you ask them to do?
I would desubsidize the entire energy sector and let things compete on merit. Interestingly enough, I was on a panel some years ago with Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, now nominee for Secretary of State, in which he agreed with that proposition. Now, it may be that he doesn't think some things are subsidies that I think are subsidies to industries like him. You wouldn't mind if we took it away, would you?
And that is an important point, right? The amount of subsidies that is worldwide being given to renewable energy, in particular energy efficiency, is about 25% of the subsidies to fossil fuels around the world. So let's indeed level the playing field. But let's do it fairly. People complain about the fact that wind attracts a production tax credit, the right to depreciate your wind investment very quickly. But exactly the same credit is available for all oil and gas exploration
And for new nuclear.
through master limited partnerships. And so if we do away with that for wind, we probably should do away with it equally for oil and gas. I agree with Amory, but I have a further reason why I'm sort of excited about this idea that we are heading to a world where the energy of the future can compete. Increasingly, the resources that have historically fueled our energy system, oil, coal, gas, are more expensive, are harder to get at, are in more capital-intensive places. And at the same time, solar and wind are coming down and down and down in price over and over again. And that unrelenting learning curve that we see is not stopping. Everything we see in the pipeline with new solar technologies like perovskites or with new capabilities for wind power lead us to believe that the reduction in price in cost for solar and wind will continue. Energy efficiency pays for itself already for a long time. The cost of LEDs has come down by 90% over the last 5 years.
Light-emitting diodes, LEDs.
Exactly, light-emitting diodes, LED
Not
lamps.
the element LED.
And LED lamps are, as a result now, definitely the best solution for every household. So these trends are, in our minds, reinforcing this idea that you shouldn't think about the energy transition as an expensive thing, but in fact as something that becomes more and more commercially
I
attractive.
think another aspect, Peter, of your question is the importance of subsidies to the existing renewable industries. Solar and wind and a few others to a lesser extent do get temporary subsidies. They're being phased out over the next few years. They are in general smaller than the permanent subsidies to fossil and nuclear competitors. But you need only look at the results of the unsubsidized auctions running around the world to see that renewables in good sites, which are rapidly expanding with technology, can actually compete just fine and beat fossil hands down, even without subsidy. So that's why new solar and wind in good sites around the world in unsubsidized auctions are winning now at 3 or even 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And the latest twist on that is solar is now becoming cheaper than wind, although they both have a long way to go down.
And in my home country, the Netherlands, the sun doesn't shine that much, but we have good wind resources, and we've just seen the latest of these auctions for offshore wind delivering a price of 5.8 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour. Again, a dramatic improvement from prices even 7-8 months ago. So these trends are accelerating and continuing.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter. And we have another question from Sam Adams, who emailed us in advance, but also is willing to get online with us. Thanks, Sam.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Thank you, RMI, for doing this call. Thank you for all the great work that you guys do. My question is about the built environment and buildings in particular, and RMI's work on this is fantastic. My question is, how do we get companies to think more about taking advantage of the opportunities with their buildings in terms of energy use and water use? What are the key solutions we should be asking them to adopt? Is it green leases or green building certifications? Is it deep energy retrofits? What's the key solution you think now?
Yeah, great question.
Thank you,
Commercial Energy
Sam.
Plus.
Yeah, so there are a number of levers that we have to pull, and we have to ideally pull all of them at the same time. And energy efficiency in the built environment is clearly one of those things that has been consistently difficult to scale. So thinking this through is a good question. First of all, we have to recognize the importance of building codes. In fact, in Europe, by 2020, the European-wide building regulation says that all new buildings have to be near zero, just like this building here. And that's, of course, a breakthrough because it will become very apparent that you can build very comfortable buildings that use virtually no energy in the same way that Amory's house was built 30 years ago. But that doesn't address the existing stock of buildings. And there are two ways of going about dealing with the existing buildings. First, there is what we call deep retrofits. Those are the buildings that are at a point in their life when it is opportune, when the right moment is there to change out the windows, change out the air conditioning system, make deep shifts in the energy footprint. And at that point, we have seen that you can achieve 40, 50, 60, 70% energy savings in an existing building. But that is usually best done at the moment that a building is sold or when a new tenant is about to move in. That doesn't happen automatically in every building, which is why we are now also working on a group of solutions that go to the operational efficiency of a building. How many of you in your office setting are not used to the fact that that blower over your head is either too hot or too cold, but it's certainly not tuned right? That half of the office is shivering and the other half is too warm. There is so much we can do now with information technology, with sensors, with better operational control of the building. So we are working on a set of solutions together with the industry that can scale much more rapidly to make existing buildings 20-30% more efficient. We don't change out massively at that point the windows or the HVAC system, but we make a big step in the right direction.
And meanwhile, we're getting to know the owners and operators and building confidence. We provide value. So then when they need to reskin the curtain wall or renew the old chillers and so on, that's the right moment to do the deep retrofit. And that's where we've discovered rapid continuing progress again in design, not just technology. In 2010, when we helped save the 38% of the Empire State Building's energy with a 3-year payback, that was considered pretty good. Until 3 years later, in a big federal office complex in Denver, we were able to save 70% cost effectively, making that difficult half-century-old building more efficient than the best new U.S. office, which in turn is only half as efficient as the one from which we're now talking to you. And now there's one in Germany that claims to use 3/5 less energy than this one. I got to go see how they do that.
Well, and I think one of the things that we instituted in this building, Amory, was personal comfort, as opposed to what you were talking about. People are...
Yes, these chairs we are sitting in.
Our hypercars, we're actually...
Hyperchairs.
Hyperchairs. Came from our old hypercars. Hyperchairs, I said when we started, we were literally in the hot seats. But I think that's something else that buildings are becoming more aware of. I love the old story that you talk about from years ago being in Japan and your guests.
I asked my hostess in Tokyo 30-odd years ago, why don't you heat your house? She said, why should I? Is the house cold? Because the house has no nervous system, no comfort sensation. People do. So these chairs from Peter Rumsey actually deliver cool or heating with a tiny bit of electricity from a laptop battery right to your body, so the building can fluctuate much more in temperature, and you'll still be perfectly comfortable.
Can we pick the last question that I see popping up? What is the biggest uncertainty that keeps you up at night that will shape our industry and our planet in the next 20 years? That's a very pertinent question. I cannot deny that on occasion I do have sleepless nights over the issue of climate change. I think about the world that we leave to my 4 children and to the next generation. The question is not whether we can solve this problem. The question really is whether we have the will to solve it fast enough. All the technologies that we need are readily available. They are increasingly commercial. We know what are the smart regulations that will help those technologies scale. We know that as we deploy those energy technologies and solutions of the future, we will create more jobs, we will bring healthier air to cities around the world, we will make our energy system more resilient, and we will address climate change. And all of that is within reach. But what it really requires is commitment from players across the industry, commitment from players across civil society, and commitment from governments to make this happen. Then we will actually find that it makes all of us wealthier, happier, and healthier. So I think it is all down to living the dream that has been laid out in Amory's energy vision for such a long time.
Yep. And, you know, the search for intelligent life on Earth continues, but some really promising specimens are turning up. We're lucky to have many of them at Rocky Mountain Institute and Carbon War Room. We're lucky to have over 1,000 of them on this call. And I think if we keep calm, carry on, and use all of our creativity and collaborative skills, we can get this done together. We just have to decide to do it and look for the opportunities right in front of us, what we are good at, what we are passionate about, what we are positioned to do, and then go do it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is how do we make sure we can continue to do this at the pace that we are working, and how can we expand? As we heard today, the many questions about where do we expand, in what countries, how can we do more, faster, so that comes to funding. We appreciate all of you being with us, National Solutions Council, all of you other donors. Will you match this anonymous donor who's actually on the call with us today from Boston? I won't tell you who she is. But thank you, and we have 48 hours to match it, plus, and we really appreciate your ongoing support, your interest. If you have any questions that we didn't get to, please continue to email them in, and we'll get back to you when we can. Thanks again on behalf of Rocky Mountain Institute Carbon War Room.
And we wish you very Merry Christmas and all the best for the new year.
Wonderful holidays.
Thank you.